The hall was filled with the soft buzz of excitement that evening. People moved around carrying instruments, adjusting microphones and whispering last-minute details. It was the night of the town's annual music showcase, and everyone in the small city seemed to have gathered there to witness it. The warm yellow lights from the stage spilled across rows of wooden chairs where families and friends waited with bright faces and small cameras ready to record their loved ones. Among the crowd stood Ethan, a tall young man in a crisp black shirt. He carried himself with a quiet kind of pride, the type that came from years of being told he was gifted. For him, music wasn't just passion, it was identity. He had played piano since he was a child, had won local competitions, and was used to the kind of applause that made him feel untouchable. As he walked toward the grand piano near the stage, several people greeted him. "You'll steal the show again tonight," someone said. He smiled confidently, replying that he'd do his best. But deep down, he believed no one else there could come close. The hall smelled of old wood and polished brass. Banners with the event's name hung above the stage, and the sound of tuning instruments filled the air. It was a mix of nervousness and excitement. The younger performers looked around with wide eyes, trying to hide their shaking hands. Parents whispered small words of encouragement from the audience seats. The atmosphere carried a sweetness that only small community events could have. Simple, hopeful, and full of dreams. That's when she entered. A quiet young woman named Maya. She slipped through the side door with her violin case pressed tightly against her chest. Her clothes were simple, her shoes scuffed from use, and her hair tied back with a faded ribbon. There was something shy about her presence, the kind that made people overlook her easily. She moved carefully through the crowd, looking for a corner to sit in. Her eyes scanned the room as if searching for safety in all the noise and laughter around her. Ethan noticed her but didn't give much thought. He saw the old violin case and thought she must be one of the beginners, maybe a student who'd practiced for a few months. He didn't mean harm. It was just how his mind worked. Years of praise had taught him to measure others before hearing them. He turned away, focusing instead on polishing his piano keys with a soft cloth. Thinking about the piece he would perform later that night, Maya found an empty chair near the side of the stage and gently opened her case. Inside lay her violin, worn at the edges, but carefully cleaned. The wood was slightly dull from age, yet the strings gleamed like threads of silver under the light. She handled it with tenderness, as though she were holding something alive. Her fingers traced the neck of the violin, her thumb brushing over a small scratch that had been there since she was 13. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a piece of her story. The sound technician walked by, handing out schedules to each performer. "You're number 7, he said to Maya. She nodded quietly, tucking the paper inside her violin case. Around her, laughter and chatter continued, but she remained silent, just breathing slowly. Ethan, standing a few meters away, practiced scales on the piano, each note crisp and showy. A few onlookers clapped lightly. Impressed by his confidence, he smiled at their attention, stealing glances at the stage lights, imagining how they'd look shining on him. A few minutes later, Maya approached the stage manager and asked softly where she could tune her violin. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan overheard and turned his head, smirking slightly. "You can tune anywhere," he said in a casual but dismissive tone. "It's not like anyone will notice a small mistake." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Not cruel, just careless. But they hit Maya harder than he realized. She didn't respond, just nodded and stepped away. Her cheeks warmed. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she found a quiet spot near the back and began tuning. She drew the bow gently across the strings, the faint hum of sound mixing with the noise of the room. At first, her hands trembled a little, but as the notes settled, so did she. The sound became smoother, more certain, and soon even a few nearby people turned to listen. Though they said nothing, Ethan didn't notice her anymore. He was too busy talking to another musician, boasting about his last performance in the city theater. But one of the judges, an older man with silver hair, did glance toward Maya. He watched the way she tuned, not with impatience but with care. He recognized something in her posture, the quiet seriousness of someone who played from the heart, not for the crowd. As the evening moved closer to start time, the air in the hall grew heavier. Lights dimmed, curtains swayed gently, and the murmurs of the audience turned into a low hush. Ethan took a seat at the edge of the stage, stretching his fingers dramatically like a professional preparing for a grand recital. Maya sat in the shadows, her eyes closed for a brief moment, whispering something under her breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. When the host stepped onto the stage to welcome the crowd, applause filled the hall. The showcase had officially begun. Ethan's heart raced with excitement, while Maya's heart beat quietly but steady. Their paths were about to cross in a way neither expected. That night everyone came to perform, but only one of them would make the hall remember what music truly meant. And though Ethan thought the night would belong to him, fate had already decided whose note would leave the world shaking. Ethan sat near the edge of the stage, his fingers dancing over the piano keys even though the show hadn't started yet. He liked to test the sound, liked how people's eyes followed the smooth rhythm of his hands. Around him, whispers of admiration floated through the air. It made him feel grounded, confident, and above all, important. He caught his reflection in the shiny black surface of the piano lid and smiled slightly. That was the image he liked best. Composed, talented, and in control. Behind him, Maya sat quietly in a corner, her violin resting on her lap. She had already tuned her instrument and now she waited, calm but distant. She wasn't used to crowds or the heavy air of competition. To her, music was a private thing, a language that lived between her heart and her hands. But tonight, she knew she'd have to speak that language in front of everyone, including people who didn't believe she belonged there. When the performers began chatting, Ethan's friend Mark leaned in and said under his breath, "That girl with the old violin case, she looks lost." Ethan gave a faint smirk. "Yeah, probably one of those hobby players who saw a YouTube tutorial and thought she could join." Mark laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You'll crush her confidence just by walking on stage." Ethan didn't correct him. He didn't even feel guilty. In his mind, it wasn't cruelty, it was simply truth. But what he didn't know was that Maya had heard every word. She hadn't meant to, but the space between them was too small. The laughter stung a little, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. People had doubted her for as long as she could remember. Too quiet, they'd said, too emotional. Not technical enough. She had learned to smile through the dismissals, but inside, every remark became a small weight she carried with her into every performance. She looked down at her violin, tracing the edge of the fingerboard with her thumb. Each mark on the wood was a memory. Her father's first gift to her, the instrument she'd practiced on since she was 8. She remembered his voice teaching her how to listen before playing. "Don't rush," he had said once. "Music isn't about speed, Maya. It's about heart." Her father had passed away 3 years ago, but his words still lived in her bow every time it touched the string. The host's voice echoed from the stage, calling out the next performer for rehearsal. Ethan straightened up. His name wasn't called yet, but he was listening carefully, judging everyone. When a young guitarist missed a few notes, he chuckled quietly and muttered, "Rookie mistake." His laughter wasn't loud, but Maya heard it, and for a moment she looked up at him. Their eyes met, his full of confidence, hers calm but deep. It wasn't defiance in her stare. It was quiet strength, the kind that said, "I don't need to prove anything. I'll just play." The show went on, performers came and went, but the gap between the two of them seemed to grow wider. Ethan kept glancing at Maya, curious despite himself. She didn't seem nervous, just thoughtful. She wasn't running through scales, wasn't pacing like others did. She simply sat there, her hands folded over her violin like someone holding a secret. When the stage manager approached to confirm the final performance order, Ethan's name was listed before hers. He nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect," he said. "No one wants to go after me anyway." The manager smiled politely. "We'll see," he said quietly, handing Maya her number next. Ethan caught that small exchange and frowned a little but brushed it off. As time passed, the audience began to fill every seat. The lights dimmed, soft chatter floated across the hall, and the performers lined up backstage. Ethan and Maya stood only a few steps apart. He could feel her calmness, and for some reason it made him uneasy. "You ready for your big debut?" he asked casually, trying to sound kind but unable to hide the edge in his tone. Maya looked up and gave a small nod. "Yes," she said softly. "I've been ready for a long time." Her voice carried no arrogance, no sarcasm, only truth. Ethan blinked, surprised by the certainty in her tone, but before he could reply, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Calling his name to the stage, Ethan took a deep breath and walked forward. The spotlight hit him as applause filled the room. He sat at the grand piano, letting the silence stretch before striking the first note. It was flawless, his fingers moved like flowing water. Perfectly controlled, every note timed to impress. The crowd swayed gently, lost in his confident rhythm, and when he finished, the applause was thunderous. Ethan stood, bowed deeply, and smiled. The satisfaction filled him like warmth. Backstage, Maya watched quietly. She clapped too, genuinely impressed, but her heart wasn't comparing. Her father had once told her, "Music isn't a race, Maya. It's a confession." She took a slow breath and held her violin close, waiting for her turn. Ethan walked off the stage, glowing from praise. His friends congratulated him, patting his shoulder. "Told you," Mark said proudly, "no one will beat that performance." Ethan nodded, looking back toward the curtains where Maya stood ready. "Let's see how she does," he whispered. A small smirk tugging at his lips, but when Maya stepped toward the light, something about her made him pause. She wasn't nervous, wasn't hesitating. Her steps were soft but firm. She adjusted the violin under her chin, closed her eyes for just a second, and the crowd fell silent even before she played. Ethan leaned slightly forward, curious despite himself. The host announced her name. "Next we have Maya Thompson," and the hall became still. Her bow hovered in the air, then touched the string, and with that single first note, Ethan's smirk disappeared. The sound was not just melody, it was memory, grief, love, and everything too real to fake. His chest tightened as if someone had reached inside and stilled his heartbeat for a moment. He didn't know why, but he suddenly realized how wrong he'd been. What he had mistaken for shyness was depth. What he had called amateur was soul. And by the time the second note rose, Ethan's hand trembled slightly, unable to understand how one sound could make him feel so small. Backstage, Ethan sat frozen on a folding chair, the sound of Maya's violin still echoing in his mind long after she'd finished. He had applauded like everyone else, but his palms had felt numb. The audience had risen to their feet in a wave of awe, faces glowing, eyes glassy with tears. He couldn't remember the last time a performance had done that, not even his own. Her music had not been loud or showy. It had been real, and that made it unforgettable. When Maya walked off stage, the crowd was still clapping. She held her violin close, eyes lowered, a small shy smile on her lips. There was no pride in her posture, no grand bow. She simply looked relieved, as if a storm inside her had finally passed. For her, that performance hadn't been about winning, it had been about release. Ethan looked up as she passed by him. She nodded politely, whispering a soft thank you when he congratulated her. But her tone wasn't like others he'd met. It wasn't soaked in competitiveness or false modesty. It was gentle, sincere and distant. It unsettled him, because for the first time he didn't know what to say. The judges took longer than usual to write their notes. The head judge, an elderly man with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned toward the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have witnessed something rare. True music is not perfection, it is emotion. And what we heard from Miss Maya was pure emotion." The audience clapped again. Ethan's name was also mentioned later for technical excellence, but his applause felt smaller now, quieter, as if people were clapping out of politeness rather than passion. After the show, the performers gathered backstage, laughing, exchanging contacts, and congratulating one another. Ethan stood apart, replaying the memory of that first note in his mind. It wasn't jealousy he felt, it was something deeper, a quiet discomfort that came from seeing truth where he hadn't expected it. He finally approached Maya, who was packing her violin into its case with careful movements. "You played beautifully," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual. "That was impressive." Maya looked up with a soft smile. "Thank you," she said. "Your piano was perfect too. You've practiced a lot." Her words carried genuine respect, no hint of irony, and that made Ethan's chest tighten slightly. He hesitated before asking, "How long have you been playing?" She looked thoughtful. "Since I was 8, she said softly. "My dad taught me. He wasn't a professional, but he believed in feeling music, not just playing it." She closed her violin case gently, her fingertips brushing against the worn handle. "He passed away a few years ago. I promised him I'd never stop playing, even if no one listened." Ethan didn't know how to respond. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years chasing applause, trophies, recognition, and suddenly he felt foolish for measuring success that way. Maya's quiet sincerity made all that seem small. He looked down at his own hands, hands that had been trained to impress, not to feel. "You should join the city orchestra," he said after a pause. With your talent, you'd be accepted immediately. She shook her head gently. Maybe one day, she replied. Right now I just play where I can. I like small halls like this. People listen differently here. You can hear their breathing when they care. Her words lingered in his mind long after she left that night. He watched her walk out into the cold, the old violin case swinging lightly by her side. She didn't look back, didn't seek anyone's praise. She just disappeared into the crowd outside, leaving him with a strange silence he couldn't name. That night Ethan went home and sat by his piano. His apartment was quiet, filled with certificates and medals framed neatly on the wall. They gleamed under the lamplight, reminders of every time he'd been celebrated. But somehow they looked empty now. He sat down and placed his fingers on the keys, but when he played, something felt missing. The notes were correct, the rhythm perfect, but there was no heart in them. He tried again, this time closing his eyes, trying to remember the way Maya had played, how her face softened, how her hands trembled slightly before the bow touched the strings. It wasn't the sound itself that had moved the audience. It was the emotion behind it. He pressed the keys gently. Trying to feel instead of perform, the melody that came out was fragile, uncertain but real. Days passed and Ethan couldn't shake her from his thoughts. He looked for her name online but found nothing. No social media, no music videos, no interviews, just silence. She was a mystery, a ghost who had walked in, changed something, and vanished. A week later, he visited the small cafe near the old train station, a quiet place known for its open mic nights. As he walked past, he heard the faint sound of a violin through the window. His heart skipped a beat. He turned and peered inside, and there she was, Maya, playing softly in the corner for a few people drinking coffee. Her eyes were closed and the same expression of calm washed over her face. The sound wasn't grand like it had been on the stage. It was smaller, gentler, but it carried the same warmth. Ethan stepped inside quietly and took a seat in the back. She didn't notice him, and he didn't interrupt. He just listened, letting the music fill the quiet space between them. When she finished, a few people clapped, and she smiled modestly, bowing slightly before sitting down. Ethan waited until the crowd thinned, then approached her table. "You really don't stop playing, do you?" he said with a small smile. She looked up, surprised but not startled. "No," she said softly. "Music keeps me breathing." He nodded slowly, then said something he'd never imagined saying before. "Would you teach me that?" She blinked. "Teach you what?" "That," he said, gesturing toward her violin. "That feeling, how to play like that." Maya laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You already know how to play better than me." He smiled faintly. "Technically, maybe," he said, "but I want to learn the part that makes people feel." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said softly, "but only if you promise not to play to impress. Play to remember." Ethan didn't fully understand her words yet, but something inside him shifted. It was the first time in years he had felt like a student again, humble and eager. And as the night deepened, two musicians sat in a quiet cafe, one rediscovering the soul of his art, and the other quietly teaching him how to listen, not with his ears but with his heart. The morning after their meeting at the cafe, Ethan woke earlier than usual. He sat beside his piano, fingers hovering over the keys but not pressing them. The memory of Maya's soft laughter and her calm voice stayed with him. "Play to remember," she had said. The words echoed like a quiet challenge inside his head. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't rush to perform. He didn't think about perfect notes or flawless timing. He simply sat there listening to the silence, to his own heartbeat, to the faint hum of the world outside his window. He decided to meet her again. The cafe opened at noon, and by the time the doors unlocked, Ethan was already waiting outside. Maya arrived a few minutes later, carrying her violin in its familiar old case. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him there. "You're early," she said with a hint of amusement. He shrugged. "I didn't want to miss my lesson." She smiled, shaking her head. "Lesson?" She repeated. "I'm not a teacher, Ethan." "You were last night," he said quietly. "You just didn't know it." They sat inside the small cafe. In a corner where the light from the window spilled gently across the table, Maya took out her violin, resting it carefully on the tablecloth. "You don't teach music," she said after a moment. "You share it, you listen, you feel, and then you let it move through you." Ethan leaned forward. Then teach me to listen, he said. She studied him for a moment, noticing the seriousness in his tone. Close your eyes, she said softly. He hesitated but obeyed. Now tell me, she continued, what do you hear? Ethan frowned slightly. I hear people talking, the clinking of cups. No, she interrupted gently. Not with your ears, listen deeper. He took a breath and tried again. I hear the rhythm of the place, the soft tapping of rain against the window. It feels calm but alive, Maya smiled. That's music, she said. It's not always made by instruments, sometimes it's just the world breathing. They spent the afternoon there, Maya playing slow, heartfelt melodies while Ethan listened. Not analyzing, not judging, just absorbing. He found himself moved by the smallest things. The tremor in her bow, the slight catch of breath before each note. It felt human, raw, and beautiful. When she stopped playing, there was a stillness that hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. See, she said quietly, it's not about skill, it's about truth. Over the next few days they met again and again, sometimes at the cafe, sometimes in the park. Ethan began to change in ways he didn't notice at first. His playing grew softer, more personal. He no longer attacked the piano with power. He spoke through it. He found himself experimenting with imperfection, letting emotion guide his rhythm instead of metronomic precision. It frightened him at first, this new vulnerability, but it also felt freeing. One evening, as the sun set behind the park trees, they played together for the first time, Maya on her violin, Ethan on a small portable keyboard he'd brought along. The air shimmered with golden light. People passing by stopped to listen. The melody they created was simple yet haunting. A child nearby tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "It sounds like a story." Ethan smiled when he heard that because it was a story, one of humility, rediscovery, and unexpected friendship. When they finished, Maya turned to him. "You're starting to hear it," she said softly. "The part that's invisible." Ethan looked down at his hands and nodded. "I used to think I was great because people clapped," he said. "Now I realize that was just noise." "Applause isn't wrong," she said gently. "It's just not everything." A week later, an invitation arrived for Ethan, a prestigious piano competition in the city, one he had applied to months ago and completely forgotten about. It was the kind of event that could bring his career back into the spotlight, the kind of stage that once defined him. He showed the letter to Maya during one of their practice sessions. "You should go," she said with a warm smile. "You were made for big stages." Ethan frowned. "Not anymore. Not without this," he said, gesturing between them. "What if I go back and lose what I've learned?" Maya placed her hand on his. "Then don't forget why you play," she said simply. "Let that be your guide." Not the judges. The night of the competition arrived. The hall was far grander than the small community center from before. Crystal chandeliers, velvet curtains, a stage that swallowed sound and sent it soaring. Ethan stood backstage, the familiar rush of nerves and adrenaline pulsing through him. But something was different this time. He wasn't afraid of mistakes. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone as he waited for his turn. His eyes scanned the crowd and then he saw her, Maya, sitting quietly in the third row, violin case resting beside her feet. Her presence steadied him like a heartbeat. He took a deep breath, stepped onto the stage, and sat at the grand piano. The first note he played was soft, trembling, full of breath. It was imperfect, but it was alive. The audience leaned in instinctively, drawn to the emotion rather than the precision. Each chord carried something new, memory, doubt, gratitude. He thought of Maya's words, of his father's advice, of the rain tapping the cafe window, and let all of it pour into his music. When he finished, there was silence, not hesitation, just awe. Then the applause came, thunderous and long. But Ethan didn't bow immediately. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Maya in the crowd. She smiled, and that was enough that night. He didn't take home the first prize, he didn't need to, because he had found something far greater. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood that music wasn't about being admired. It was about being heard, truly heard. And when he left the stage, the sound that followed him wasn't applause, it was peace. When the applause faded and the crowd began to leave the grand hall, Ethan remained seated by the piano. His fingers rested lightly on the keys, unwilling to let go. The echo of his last note still lingered in his chest like a heartbeat. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, but when he finally stood, The world felt different, quieter, softer, as though something heavy inside him had finally been set down. Maya waited for him by the side door, her violin case slung across her shoulder. When he saw her, a small smile broke across his face. He didn't say anything at first, just walked up to her and whispered, "You came." She nodded. "I wouldn't miss it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't win," he said softly. "But for the first time, I don't care." Maya's eyes softened. "That's how you know you really did." They walked outside together, the city glowing under warm streetlights. A light drizzle had started, making the pavement shimmer like glass. Ethan tilted his head toward the sky, letting the raindrops cool his face. "You know," he said with a quiet laugh, "I used to think I understood music. Tonight proved I was only memorizing it." Maya smiled. "That's because you played with your mind, not your soul tonight." You let them meet. They reached the cafe where they had first talked. It was late, but the owner, an old man who loved seeing musicians there, waved them in. They sat in their usual corner. Steam rising from their mugs outside, the rain turned heavier, drumming softly against the window. "So what happens now?" Maya asked. Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. I don't want to go back to how things were. I don't want the empty applause anymore." "Then don't," she said. "Play for what matters." He looked at her, really looked, noticing for the first time the faint tiredness beneath her calm expression. "You always talk about playing from the heart," he said. "But who listens to you when you play?" Maya hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around her cup. "No one really," she admitted. "I've played for people, but I've never played with anyone." Ethan smiled softly. "Then maybe it's time someone listened." In the days that followed, they started performing together more often. Sometimes in parks, sometimes in old libraries, or quiet corners of the city where people gathered not for prestige but for peace. They called their small sessions listening nights, no posters. No tickets, no spotlight, just music and honesty. People came, not in large numbers, but enough to fill the room with warmth. Some cried, some smiled, but all left lighter. Word spread slowly, and soon local newspapers wrote about the pianist who plays like he's telling a secret, and the girl whose violin makes the city stop for a breath. Ethan found the attention strange this time. It wasn't the fame he once chased, it felt earned, honest, grounded in something real. One afternoon, after a small performance at a children's hospital, Maya stood by the window, watching the young patients wave goodbye. Their smiles were faint but bright. Ethan walked up beside her. "You make them forget for a while," he said quietly. Maya shook her head. "They remind me," she replied. "That pain has its own melody." Ethan looked at her curiously. "You always sound like you're quoting poetry," he said with a smile. She laughed softly. "Maybe music just teaches us to talk differently." They began writing songs together, pieces that blended the warmth of her violin with the depth of his piano. Each one told a story, not of perfection but of life, of loss, hope, rediscovery, and forgiveness. They played them in small community centers and schools, choosing places where the audience needed comfort more than entertainment. But one evening, after a performance in an old church, Maya suddenly grew quiet. She sat on the pew, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan turned to her, worried. "You okay?" She hesitated, then said softly, "My father always wanted to hear me play like this, but he never got the chance. He died before I understood what he was really teaching me." Ethan placed his hand gently on hers. "Maybe he's hearing you now," he said. "Every note you play feels like it's reaching someone beyond the room." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled. "You sound like him," she whispered. He used to say the same thing. For a long moment they sat in silence, the flickering candlelight painting their faces in gold. The church was empty except for them, and in that stillness Ethan reached for his piano. Maya lifted her violin, and together they played. Not for an audience, not for praise, but for the ones they missed, for the ones who had shaped them, for the quiet voices that still lived inside their music. The melody rose slowly, gentle but powerful, filling the empty church with something holy. It was grief and healing intertwined. When they finished, neither spoke. There was no need. The silence that followed was enough. Days turned into weeks, and their small performances became a quiet movement across town. Ethan and Maya were invited to perform at schools, therapy centers, and even prisons, places forgotten by music but hungry for it. Every stage they played on carried the same honesty. They didn't dress fancy, didn't care about lights or cameras. All that mattered was connection. One night, after a performance at a rehabilitation center, an old man walked up to them with tears in his eyes. "I haven't cried in 30 years, he said softly. "But tonight, I remembered my wife." Ethan and Maya exchanged a look, both smiling quietly. That was the real reward, touching a soul, not winning a prize. As they packed up their instruments, Maya turned to him and said, "You've changed." He smiled faintly. "No," he said. "You just helped me remember who I was before I started pretending." She laughed softly. "Then I guess the music finally reached you too." That night, under the glow of the streetlights, they walked home together in silence, no words, no plans, just the sound of rain falling softly around them. The world seemed smaller, warmer, more real for both of them. It was no longer about proving anything, it was about feeling everything. And in that moment, Ethan knew. The journey that had begun with arrogance had turned into something purer, an echo of truth carried not by applause, but by the quiet power of a single note shared between two hearts that finally understood each other. The winter came early that year. The city's streets turned silver with frost, and the cafe where Maya and Ethan often played became a small refuge of warmth. Inside, fairy lights hung above the window, glowing softly against the cold night. The regulars had grown to love them, the way his piano wrapped around her violin like a conversation between old friends. But that evening, something felt different. Maya's chair at the corner table was empty, her tea untouched, her violin missing from its usual spot beside the wall. Ethan checked his watch, tapping his fingers against the cup in front of him. She was never late, not even once. The clock ticked quietly, but the silence in between felt heavy. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through their messages, and typed, "Are you okay?" Then erased it, typed it again, and sent it. No reply came. He waited another hour before finally standing, wrapping his scarf around his neck and heading out into the cold. The snow had begun to fall, slow and delicate, blurring the edges of the streetlights. He walked the familiar route to her small apartment above a florist's shop. The windows were dark, the sign downstairs flipped to closed. He rang the bell once, then again. No sound, no movement, just the hum of the city below. The next morning, a call came from the hospital. Maya had fainted while teaching music to a group of children at a community center. "Exhaustion," the nurse had said. "She'll be okay." But Ethan's chest tightened as he rushed to see her. When he entered the small room, she was sitting up, pale but smiling. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. "You should be resting." "Not worrying." He pulled a chair beside her bed. "Resting?" he repeated. "You scared everyone." She laughed faintly. "I didn't mean to. I guess I've been pushing too hard lately." Ethan frowned. "You've been skipping meals again, haven't you?" She didn't answer, just looked out the window where the snow fell like soft ash. "There's so much I want to finish," she whispered. "So many songs left to play." He watched her quietly, the sunlight glinting against the white band around her wrist. "Then we'll play them," he said firmly. "But not like this. You need to take care of yourself too." "Maya." Her eyes met his, tired but gentle. "You sound like my father again," she said, smiling faintly. "Always telling me to slow down." He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply reached out and held her hand. "Then maybe you should listen this time," she chuckled softly, squeezing his fingers. "You never change, do you?" "I do," he said quietly. "I just change in the parts no one sees." In the weeks that followed, Maya recovered slowly, but she refused to stop playing. Music, she said, was her way of breathing. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he rearranged their performances, moving them to smaller spaces and fewer nights. "You don't have to prove anything," he told her. "People already listen." But Maya shook her head gently. "No," she said, "it's not about proving. It's about leaving something behind." That phrase lingered in Ethan's mind. Leaving something behind? It sounded final, like a quiet preparation. He didn't want to believe it, but something in her tone carried a truth he couldn't ignore. One snowy evening, she invited him to her apartment for the first time. He climbed the narrow staircase and entered a small, warm space filled with books, candles, and music sheets scattered across the table. Her violin rested on the bed beside an unfinished composition. "It's my last one," she said softly. "I've been writing it for months." Ethan sat beside her, studying the notes on the paper. The melody looked gentle, slow and incomplete. "What's it called?" he asked. "The Note That Stays," she said, smiling faintly. They spent hours working on it together, sometimes arguing over a single chord, sometimes sitting in silence listening to the wind outside. When the melody finally took shape, it felt like a letter, a message written not in words, but in feeling. It carried both sorrow and peace, like something that wanted to say goodbye without actually leaving. Maya's health continued to waver through the winter. She grew quieter, her laughter rarer, but her eyes, those calm, shining eyes, still carried warmth one night. After finishing another session at the cafe, Ethan offered to walk her home. The streets were nearly empty, the snow falling in thick, soft layers. "You ever think about what happens when the music stops?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was calm, almost curious. Ethan glanced at her. "No," he said honestly. "Because I don't want it to," she smiled faintly. "That's the thing," she whispered. "The music never really stops. It just changes form." They reached her building, and she turned to him at the door. "Promise me something," she said. "If one day I can't play anymore, you'll finish the song." Ethan shook his head. "Don't talk like that," she smiled again. That same soft, peaceful smile. "Promise," she said quietly. He hesitated, then finally nodded. "I promise." The next few weeks passed like the last pages of a story neither of them wanted to end. They played The Note That Stays once, just once, in front of a small audience at the cafe. No announcements, no introductions. When they finished, no one clapped, they just sat there, silent. Moved beyond words a month later. Maya's chair in the cafe was empty again, this time for good. She passed away in her sleep, peaceful, the doctors said. Ethan found out the next morning through a call that blurred into white noise. He sat by his piano all night, the world outside frozen and still. Then at dawn, he opened the sheet music she had left behind. Her handwriting curved across the top. For the one who learned to listen. Tears slid down his cheeks as he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play The Note That Stays. The melody rose gently through the empty apartment, soft but unbroken. Outside, the sun began to rise, touching the frost with light. And though her chair would remain empty forever, her song, their song, lived on, echoing in every quiet space where love and music still dared to meet. The first morning without her felt unreal. The world outside Ethan's window looked the same. Same sky, same street, same sound of the neighbor's dog barking. But everything felt different, as if the air itself had lost its rhythm. The piano sat silent in the corner. Her violin case still leaned against the wall where she had once left it after rehearsal. For a long time he couldn't bring himself to touch either. He simply sat on the floor listening to the hum of nothing, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket he didn't ask for. Days blurred together. He didn't eat much, didn't leave the house except to buy coffee he never finished. The messages on his phone piled up, friends, reporters, people from the cafe, all asking if he was okay. He ignored them all, because how could he explain that he wasn't broken in one place? But in every note, one evening he found the courage to open her old composition folder, tucked neatly inside her violin case. Each page smelled faintly of her perfume, a mix of vanilla and rain. Her handwriting danced across the paper, soft, looping, careful. She had written fragments of melodies, half-thought lyrics, and little notes in the margins, too soft here. Let the emotion breathe, don't rush this part. Ethan traced those words with his fingertips, whispering them to himself like prayers. At the very back of the folder, he found an envelope, unsealed, addressed in her handwriting to Ethan. His breath caught. He unfolded it slowly, her words written in blue ink. Simple, unpolished, honest. If you're reading this, I probably didn't get to say goodbye, but please know that our music changed me. It helped me heal parts of myself I thought were gone forever. You taught me to believe that sound could be truth. I hope I helped you believe it too. Don't let silence become your home, Ethan. There are still so many people who need to hear what we made, finish what we started, and remember, music doesn't end when one of us stops playing. It just waits for you to continue the note. The letter slipped from his fingers. Landing softly on the floor, he closed his eyes, the ache in his chest mixing with something new. A pull, a call, the kind she always spoke about that night. He sat at the piano again for the first time since she passed. The room was cold, the lights dim. He took a deep breath, placed his fingers on the keys, and began to play. At first, the notes wobbled, fragile and uneven, But as he went on, the melody found shape, her melody, the note that stays, it rose gently, wrapping around the walls, filling the room with her voice even though she was gone. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't stop. Every chord felt like a heartbeat, every pause a breath between them. It was as if she were still there, guiding his hands the way she used to. Slower, he could almost hear her whisper. Feel it. Don't force it. By the time the last note faded, Ethan was shaking, not from grief, but from the overwhelming realization that she was right. Music never ends, it only changes form. He closed his eyes, whispering into the stillness, I'm still listening. Maya. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to rebuild himself piece by piece. He returned to the cafe, carrying both his piano sheet and her violin case. The owner looked at him with teary eyes but said nothing, just turned on the soft lights and left him alone. Ethan set the case on the empty chair beside him and started to play. The regulars began to return one by one, drawn by the rumor that the pianist who lost his partner still plays for her. They sat quietly. No phones, no chatter, just listening. And when he finished, they didn't clap. They simply nodded, some wiping their eyes. Because everyone in that room understood what it meant to lose someone and still find a way to speak through the pain. Soon, Ethan began traveling to places they had once dreamed of visiting together. Small towns, hospitals, schools. He carried her violin with him everywhere, sometimes placing it on stage beside him, other times holding it during performances like a relic. He called his new tour The Note That Stays, just as she had named the final piece. At one performance in a small coastal town, a little girl approached him after the show, clutching a cheap plastic violin. "Mister," she said shyly, "how do you play like you're remembering someone?" Ethan knelt down and smiled. "Because I am," he said gently, "and maybe one day, you will too." He began teaching children after that, not just how to play, but how to listen. He repeated Maya's lessons, her phrases, her patience. "Don't play to impress," he'd say. "Play to remember." Her wisdom lived on in every classroom, every rehearsal, every trembling young hand that touched an instrument for the first time. Months later, he returned to the city hall where they had first met. It had been renovated since, brighter, more modern, but he could still see the ghosts of that night, the pride on his face, the doubt in hers, the silence after her first note. The stage felt sacred now. He placed the violin on the stool beside the piano and began to play. The Note That Stays one last time. As the final chord hung in the air, the audience rose in silence. He looked at the empty chair beside him and smiled faintly, whispering, "We did it, Maya." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow. The world was quiet, peaceful, and though she was gone, Ethan knew that somewhere, beyond the edge of sound, her music was still playing, just in a different key that night. He wrote her name on the final page of their sheet music and closed it gently. Then he placed the violin on the piano and turned off the lights. The moonlight fell through the window, brushing against the strings, and for a moment, just for a moment, it looked as if they shimmered on their own. And in that glow, Ethan smiled through his tears, because he understood now. Some notes never fade, some songs never end, and some souls stay forever in the music they leave behind. A year had passed since Maya's final song, yet her presence still lingered in every corner of Ethan's life. Sometimes it appeared as a faint whisper in his dreams, other times in the echo of a chord that sounded too alive to be just his own. He had learned to live with that kind of haunting, not as a wound but as a gift. The silence that used to suffocate him now felt sacred, like a stage waiting for the next note. The world had changed around him. The cafe where they once played had grown busier. A framed photograph of Maya now hung on the wall near their old table. A small plaque beneath it read, "The Note That Stays, in loving memory of Maya Thompson, whose music still breathes through us." Ethan never asked for it, but the owner put it there anyway. "People should know," the old man had said. "She didn't just play music. She gave it." Ethan had become a quiet figure in the city's music scene. His concerts were no longer grand or loud. Instead, they were intimate, dimly lit halls, small audiences, no fanfare, no introduction. He often began with a story before playing, not about fame or triumph, but about a girl with a scratched violin and a heart too big for the world. The crowd always listened in silence, some with tears, some with smiles, And when he'd finished the note that stays, there would always be a moment of stillness before anyone dared to breathe again. But deep inside, Ethan felt something unfinished. He had kept his promise to continue her music. Yet there was one thing she had always wanted: to record their final piece together. Not for awards or fame, but so the song could exist long after they were gone. He had avoided it for months, afraid that recording it would make it final. Like closing the last page of a book he didn't want to end. But one night, after performing at a small theater by the river, he sat by the window of his apartment, the moonlight spilling across the piano keys, and whispered, "All right, Maya, let's do it." The next morning, he booked an old analog studio. No modern equipment, no filters, just pure sound. The engineer, a quiet man with silver hair, recognized him. "You want something polished?" he asked. "No," Ethan replied softly. "I want something true." He placed Maya's violin on a chair beside him, the same one she had played that night of her unforgettable debut. He positioned the microphone between the piano and the empty space where she would have stood. The red recording light flickered on, and for a long moment he didn't move. He just looked at the violin, at the faint scratches along its edge, at the bow still tucked neatly inside the case. Then he began to play. The melody rose softly, gentle, trembling real halfway through the song. Something shifted. The air in the room thickened, and a single vibration echoed from the violin's string. Faint but clear, Ethan froze, his breath catching. It couldn't be. The room was empty, yet the note hung there, as if she had touched the string from somewhere unseen. He smiled through the tears spilling down his cheeks and whispered, "Still playing with me, huh?" And then continued. The recording went on for 20 minutes. Longer than the original song because he kept repeating the last part, the part she'd once called the echo of goodbye. When it was over, he sat in silence, his hands trembling, the piano keys damp from tears. The engineer stepped into the booth quietly, his expression pale. "There was something in there," he said softly. "The violin, it sounded like someone played along." Ethan didn't answer. He just nodded. "I know," he said, "leave it in." The recording was released 2 months later, simply titled The Note That Stays. Final version. No advertising, no interviews, no label push. Yet within weeks it spread across platforms and found its way into hearts all over the world. People wrote messages saying they listened while driving, while grieving, while healing. And every single one said the same thing. "It felt like someone was in the room with me." Ethan didn't seek recognition, but the world gave it anyway. Invitations poured in, awards, collaborations, film scores, but he turned most of them down. He preferred quiet rooms, music schools, and hospital halls, the kind of places where music wasn't just background noise, but medicine. One evening, after teaching a class of young musicians, a teenage girl lingered behind as others left. She looked nervous, clutching a violin to her chest. "Mr. Ethan," she said softly, "I don't think I'll ever be good enough to play on stage." He smiled, recognizing the same trembling doubt Maya once carried. "You don't need to be perfect," he said gently. "Just be honest." "The music doesn't care about mistakes, it only cares if you mean it," she nodded, then hesitated. "That song you wrote, The Note That Stays, did you really play it alone?" Ethan looked at the violin sitting in the corner of the room and smiled faintly. "No," he said softly. "Not alone." Years passed, and Ethan grew older. His hands slower but still steady. His hair turned gray, his voice softer. But his heart stayed full. He continued to play, every performance a quiet prayer, every song a conversation with the one who had taught him how to listen. And though audiences changed, though faces came and went, one thing remained constant: the silence that followed his music. That sacred stillness when people felt before they clapped. On his final concert night, held once again in the same community hall where it had all begun, he sat at the piano while the audience waited. The lights dimmed, and he looked toward the empty chair beside him, the same chair he had kept empty at every show. "For her," he whispered to the crowd. "Always for her." He began playing The Note That Stays slower than ever before. Each note fell like snow, gentle, weightless, eternal. As he reached the final chord, his hands paused in midair, the sound trembling softly through the hall. Then, just for a heartbeat, the faintest echo of a violin joined him. Pure, sweet, unearthly. Ethan smiled, tears sliding freely down his face, and whispered, "You kept your promise too." The audience sat frozen, not daring to move. They didn't know if the sound had been real or just something beyond their understanding, but everyone there felt it. The presence, the connection, the love that refused to fade. When the final note dissolved into silence, Ethan closed his eyes, his hands still resting on the keys.